Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending upon when you're watching this webinar. Again, this is Dave Nagel. Very excited to share some more information with my friends and colleagues at Carlisle. Going into webinar 4 now, overview of cognitive rigor part 1. I'm going to jump right in and keep the length of the webinar as short as possible. As always, there's your text question, or my cell phone for any text, email questions. A couple have already come in, really appreciate that. And we're going to just jump right into our success criteria. For this particular webinar, to understand and know the 4 myths of cognitive rigor. We talk a lot about rigor, and we're going to get into how we build that into our assessment and ensure that it's at the right, accurate level of rigor based on our standards. And then understand the importance of looking at the 4 levels of depth of knowledge, DOK, when designing assessment items. So hopefully you have your working handout available. I'm going to ask you to take a moment, pause the recording, and define cognitive rigor. Just take a moment, pause the recording. If you're in a group, have a short discussion. I'm going to bring us back in about 15 seconds, but you need to pause as long as possible. I'm going to give you just a little bit of time, and then I'm going to continue on. So pause the recording, and please complete reflection question number 1. Welcome back. Hopefully you've had a chance to do so. And I'm guessing, with rare exception, some of your responses were difficult, requiring thinking, could go on and on. It's interesting when you look at the definition of rigor. What you see are words like rigid, harsh, strict, firm, because it comes from the Latin, from the same term as rigor mortis. So sometimes our definition or understanding of rigor hasn't quite always been what it needs to be. There's 4 myths about rigor. Williamson and Blackburn are kind of the experts in digging in here. There's 4 myths. First one on the left-hand side, it's not about more work or quantities of work or that we give a lot of homework. It's unfortunate, but parents sometimes assume, well, my kid goes to a good school because he gets a lot of work. It's not about quantity of work. In fact, if anything, that leads to a lack of rigor because it leads to compliance-based learning. There's a myth that some kids can't do it, or that if I have to support you early, that it's no longer rigorous. And think about hitting a base pitch baseball. Whether we're with our little guys or we're at the high school varsity level, sometimes kids struggle, and we do take them over, do some soft toss, and have them hit off the tee, and then just because I supported you early doesn't mean that it's lost its ability to have the same amount of rigor or difficulty. So when we dig into depth of knowledge, it's the degree or complexity of knowledge reflected in the content standards. So when we look at our standards, based on the content that students are going to have to understand, how deeply will they have to understand it for a given response on an assessment? What will they have to produce around the content? And this is why this will really drive not only our assessment building, but maybe some of the instructional tools that we use. And that doesn't mean we can't scaffold, doesn't mean we can't break it down if we need to, but it might align or help us utilize some of our existing curriculum more effectively. And it is a time that we have to push Benjamin off to the side. He served his time well. But Bloom's was always based on the difficulty of the verb, and Bloom's was a taxonomy that you would scaffold and grow from know to understand to apply, etc. Depth of knowledge is not a taxonomy. It's based on the cognitive demand and the context and how the verb will be used and the depth of thinking required. And the assessment question will determine the cognitive demand, not the student work. We might have things that are much more rigorous that require less of a response, but there's deeper elements within the response. And I think this is where, as teachers, we can acknowledge we are all very busy. We don't have anywhere near the amount of time that we need to do our jobs well. This might help us save time with some of the maybe unnecessary tools we're using and replace them with ones that are more quality, but they might mean that students aren't producing the same quantity of responses, but we're looking for the quality. And we can give better feedback because we're not trying to collect it all at one time. What does DOK look like in the classroom? When we break it down, depth of knowledge 1, there's one right answer. And so one of the videos that I might show when we come together, some of you might have seen it, it takes the 4 levels of DOK through the Gettysburg Address, 7 years ago. If we ask students, what does that mean? That's a simple math problem. It's just 87. They just have to figure it out. There's one correct answer. It's really a DOK 1. DOK 2 is that there's one correct answer, but there's some justification. So if we ask why was 7 years ago an important relevant point Lincoln made, well, it's because 87 years before the Gettysburg Address, we'd signed the Declaration of Independence and our Constitution. It said all men were created equal. So that alone is why that term is important. There's a precipice between 2 and 3. When we get into the DOK 3, there's more than one correct answer. There's more than one right answer, which is why we often might need a scoring guide. But that's taking that to that next level. DOK 4 is extended to deep thinking, most often requires multiple sources. Few standards are written at a 4. So when we look at an individual standard, it might not be. But when we connect multiple standards, which almost always happens at all grade levels as we get past the early primary, students are doing conceptual learning. They're learning multiple pieces back and forth between multiple standards. And I want to just share when we look at why this is important, if we take a look at these 3 items where they use the same verb, describe. Describe the 3 main parts of a eukaryotic cell. Well, there's only 3. There's the cell membrane, the cytoplasm, and the nucleus. We describe the differences between plant and animal cells. There's multiple differences, but there's pretty much a ceiling, but they've got to justify why there are differences. Plant cells have a larger vacuole to store more water. But if we're asking students to describe a model that they would use to represent the inner workings of a cell and how the parts function together, there's multiple right answers. There's multiple paths students can take. So you can see here, we can't just lean on that verb, describe, and think that we have the same accurate rigor level between the 3. Why this will also be important as we're designing our assessments, there is the ability, and we're going to get into this, on making sure that our selected response items, our multiple choice, our matching, things of that nature, can really provide us with some really quality information, and we can score those quickly. Students can take them quickly. So if we have a DOK 1 or 2, there's nothing wrong with those. When we get into DOK 3, we're going to need some kind of constructed response. Now, that could be justify why this was the best answer. It doesn't always have to be an elaborate paragraph that's taking us forever to score and grade and things of that nature. But this can really help us determine what tools we're using when we're assessing our students and make the best use of the assessment types and hopefully invest in saving the most amount of time and still getting the best information from our students. So, reflection question number 2. What are some reflections you have for this overview, or for some, I'm sure it's a review. It might be a review of depth of knowledge that you were aware of before, but it gives you another thing to think about. So pause the recording. I'll pause momentarily. If you're in a group watching, great time to discuss your responses after. I'll pause the recording as long as you need. Be back in just a moment. Welcome back. As always, I just assume that you've paused it as long as you need, and then we'll continue on. So, back to our success criteria. Hopefully you can articulate the 4 myths of cognitive rigor, and you can understand more the importance when we use depth of knowledge when designing our assessment items. The next webinar is going to get into how we use that to go through a deeper level of unwrapping the standards. As always, I thank you for your time. I'm really excited for coming back to Carlisle 1st of February. And again, if you have any questions ahead of time, please shoot me an email, davenagelvlplus@gmail.com. Hope you have a great rest of your day.